Welcome to our third session. In our first session, we talked about this movement from doom to delight. In our second session, we talked about the responsibility that you have as a director of a corporation. In our third session, we're going to be looking at property valuation.
So we want to start with a story of a church that came to us and explained that they have an $80 million church. And we thought, that's so exciting. What are you referring to when you make that assessment? It's a valuation. It's an understanding of how much the property is worth. And in that case, you may have guessed it already, they were referring to the insured building valuation. The cost to rebuild that, in that case, a grade 1 heritage listed building, exactly the way that it was, with its very fine organ and beautiful finials in the woodwork and the masonry. The idea, however, that the building is worth $80 million is far more complicated. If you're Jeff or you're Jane, you may say, this is not complicated at all. A property has an independent, professional valuation from a company like Altus, a well-known, reputable company that this is what they do every day. And that is, to one large extent, absolutely true. It's one of the best types of valuations that we could ever talk about. Our point in this session is understanding the other types of valuations that you will encounter with other members of your board, with the city, with your neighbors, with your denomination, of other ways in which they value or you may value the property. And those valuations will all come and play a part in the decisions that you make. So what we're going to do in this session is just go through some of what those valuations are, and then we're going to run some scenarios in helping you explain how those different valuations can come up with very, very different assessments of the options that you may face. So the first, let's put it on the board. It's that insurance valuation, and it is based largely on the rebuild cost of the property that you have. It's especially high in the case of a heritage building. Number two is the municipal valuation. If you are in an area of high urban density, you'll find you're surrounded by commercial properties. There may be other residential properties around as well. And as those properties are valued, in some cases based on the rents that they'll bring in other cases based on a valuation that will go specifically to that property, the municipal valuation will rise as a whole neighborhood. So when you see a new valuation from your municipality, which in many cases will also show a zero rate of tax, you'll find that that valuation will go up steadily. That's not to be misunderstood or misinterpreted as though an inspector has come past your building and given a specific valuation for your building. The third is the kind of valuation that a developer might offer for sure. And why do we jump right into that? Well, very often the churches we're working with have often been approached by developers. And usually there will be some kind of number where the developer will say, I could give you between this number and this number. Very often, somebody shrewd on your board will say, well, what number are you precisely looking to make? Would you like to make us an offer? We'll come back to that as we talk about the different characters and our high recommendation to make sure that you have a property broker before those offers are received. That's a side note. But going back to that idea, the developer will give a range of options based on what they think they can develop. And we'll get into this in the next session, specifically on development, but the developer's potential value often, again, feels higher at the beginning and will feel lower when the deal is done, in a sense, if you are doing a development. Within that, there are all kinds of questions of what a developer might do. So the highest usual result for the value of the land, as we will talk about in the next session, is around condominiumized housing units sold to individual owners, condominiumized ownership of that building, a condo tower, colloquially known. As you look at rental housing, affordable rental housing, social housing, you go lower in the value, and this becomes a trade-off in terms of what social objectives you would like to make and going forward from there. The next types of valuations look at keeping your existing property and look at the rental value of what could be taken from that property if you were to rent it. This is in the realm of a phrase that gets used called highest and best use. Often that's talking about a development of if you could delete the entire building and start again and start fresh. But highest best use can also be understood to look at the existing structure and how it could be rented maximally. As soon as we start talking about things like the pews not coming out or not being willing to bring the building up to building code, we get into the question of, is this a Class A, Class B, Class C space?
That's right.
And this is all in reference to the kind of money that could be brought in from rental. Many churches are not willing to rent their prime spaces, and often they have an assumption that if they were to rent, they'll rent to community groups. So now the valuation has changed again because they're using what would be described as less than market rate rents. If you want to know what the market rate rents are, it's another reason why a professional valuation is quite helpful. We're not suggesting that every building should be developed or every building that remains should be rented at market rates or above market rates. In fact, our assumption is probably the opposite, that you want to be renting at below market rents. However, we want to suggest that you should know the discount level that you are considering applying as you think about what you're doing. What that means is, if you're giving a 95% discount to a scout group or a 95% discount to an Alcoholics Anonymous group, those are decisions you may want to make. But we believe that in understanding the discount or the valuation and the way in which you're discounting it, you'll be better informed.
And along those lines, Graham, also, when we're talking about church properties and spaces to rent within, a lot of them are musty. The curtains are not really that pretty. Kind of looks like great-grandmother's living room in some ways. So you have this reality.
Kind of is great-grandma.
It kind of is great-grandma's living room. So you have this reality that people don't actually want to rent it.
Yeah.
So how do we, again, look at the valuation from what's true and real, but also if we could move it from a C to a B, what do we need to do to increase that value?
This is where things start getting a little bit harder. And it's another place where you'll have a nice disclaimer from Dave and I of saying there is the work here of professional valuation companies. But here's the kind of thing that's going to be harder to get to. How do you deal with the reality that you may feel obliged, maybe you are obliged legally, to repair a building with a heritage value that is far beyond its stated valuation in a professional valuation? In other words, does this property actually have a negative valuation? Let's workshop what this feels like, okay? Let's imagine a local charity sees you as a congregation that's maybe at the end of its life cycle. They know that you have $15 million of renovations to do on that property, and you'd like to sell it to them for $4 million. They're looking at that and saying, well, maybe we can resell it to somebody else for $4 million. Maybe we can take that to a lender. But we know we need to come up with $15 million of heritage renovations before we do that. Isn't that kind of worth negative 10 million or somewhere in there? And those kinds of questions, although there are certain real estate principles that will tell you that's not exactly true, from the point of view of other buyers, especially if they're not a developer, they may perceive the valuation in that way. Others of you may perceive that as well, to say, this building is a noose around our neck. It's weighing us down. We can't do anything because of that sense that we have to, or that legal obligation to repair that building. So the concept of a conceptual negative valuation, it's used, and see if you're ready for this. This is an awful analogy, but it's akin to a property with toxic waste on it. Property with toxic waste has to be cleaned up by the new owner, in the same way as a property with a heritage building on it has to be repaired. You can't allow it to simply fall down. The municipality may compel you to repair it. You may have seen properties that are allowed to run down in that way. It's a very dangerous game to play, and it's one, unfortunately, that many of the congregations we're working with are facing. The next type of valuation is understanding the possibility of selling your property at a particular period of time. Let me put it this way. If you have one thing to sell and you're the only one to sell it, your price will be affected in that particular way. You have a rare good. If, however, the market is flooded and there are 10 versions of exactly the same thing that you want to sell up on the market at the same time, you will, by definition, flood the market. Right now, we are already seeing a flooding of the market of small local congregational churches, and we believe we're going to see even more. It's for that reason that our entire thesis is to try to get regions to be thinking about these things together, to make sure that we're not flooding the market and selling these properties in a kind of a fire sale. If we do, the main loser is the community who hopes that that place will one day serve either as new housing or as some kind of ongoing community or perhaps faith building as well.
Yeah, and because we haven't put in the time and energy to think about what imagination could look like, what often happens is churches face the crisis of what do we do? They feel stuck, and often sale becomes that only narrative. And what we're trying to, again, do is to say, maybe there could be other stories that emerge than just the sale story.
The final type of valuation is your understanding of the long-term valuation. And this is the question of what is this property going to be worth in 30 years, 50 years, 100 years? This is a question, again, that only professional urban planners and developers who have that kind of range can give an answer on. But it's one that faces many congregations, denominations, trying to ask the question, if we know that the way we're using this property now isn't working, could we find a new way for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Wouldn't it be a good idea to try to hold on to this property? We don't have an answer for you on that, but it's the kind of question that comes up and further complicates this question. How much is this property worth? So where do you go with this question of property valuation? Why is it important? Our first suggestion is to make sure that you get an independent professional valuation early on in this journey. You may also want to get a building condition report, and if there's any chance that that property is going to remain as it is today, that is an essential part of your decision making. Questions further about hazardous materials, materials like asbestos, other types of potential contamination on the site, including fuel oil tanks. These are all things that are part of assessing the value and the risk of your property as you understand some of the opportunities that may be presented to you and the financial and missional outcomes of those decisions. Another example that we see often is of churches that are selling their hall without understanding that if they did want to rent the sanctuary, the main part of the church, to some other organization, but perhaps move their Wednesday night prayer meeting to the hall, well, they can't do it because they've sold the hall, which means they can't get that maximum rental for the sanctuary. So again, by understanding the piece that's been sold off, they've not necessarily done that with thinking about future rental in mind.
Right.
So our recommendation, isn't it, is always,
yes,
do this process. Take this time before you start selling little slices of your property. We see it too often.
Yeah, and in this case, with what happened is coming to us and going, can you listen to the land? And it was really quickly realized that, no, this is not a good decision to rezone and sell off part of the property. Does not then give you actually the best solution on what's possible for creating the community hub in which you dream of. So we were able to pause that and go, no, this isn't the best decision. Here's a more holistic path forward. And I think what happens is, as you've said this over and over again, Graham, when we face crisis, we make stupid decisions. So crisis comes, roof happens, it needs done, masonry falls, it's falling apart. Something happens where, oh no, what are we going to do? And well, let's sell this piece. Let's do this. And what it does is it in the end causes us to not actually live into a sustainable future.
Another great example, I'm going to call this church St. James's. Okay, it's not St. James's, it has another name. But they had a very interesting property where they had their main church with a hall and a parking lot, which was a pretty good sized parking lot. They then had another whole parking lot, which was over, I think, 1.5 acres in land. They then decided they were going to sell that to a local homeless shelter who wanted to build a new shelter. They were going to sell that for $2 million. As it happened, that property was in a city, in an environment in a time where the market valuation was actually $4.5 million. In the end, in partnership with a good local broker, we ended up testing the market for them. We said to the church, we know that you want to help that homeless shelter, but what if you get significantly more than that money? And they were to build on another part of your site, the site was big enough for that, or perhaps they go somewhere else. In the end, that valuation went to the homeless shelter. The homeless shelter said, we really don't want to build there anymore. We hadn't understood the value of that particular piece of land. We actually found somewhere else, and we give you our blessing, church, to sell that property and maybe be generous to us when you make the proceeds of some of that sale. In the end, that parcel of land, as you recall, Dave, it actually sold for over $8 million. So the church now had an additional $8 million to figure out what to do with their large heritage building. They put that into Originally or initially, the next stage was to fix up the basement and eventually to be able to get into the sanctuary. But understanding the value of that piece of land within their broader parcel, it changed the entire dynamic. Yeah. And by keeping everybody around the table, we were able to have that conversation very openly.
Here's a story, Graham, on a negative valuation where you have a church who is coming to the end of its time. It realizes that it needs to wrap up, and they gift their building to a new church plant in their neighborhood. And again, I've seen this over and over again, specifically with even a friend of mine who assumes the church, they think that they're getting a free property. But what they didn't realize is that within 2 weeks of them assuming ownership of that new space, the roof leaks. And now they have a $50,000 bill to repair the roof. And then the boiler goes. And then, so now this church plant is completely sunk because they assumed what was good news of a free space actually came with a burden that many of you are facing within your buildings.
And we've seen that one happen a few times, haven't we, Dave, where the church going out says, actually, this is probably the value of our property, but there's a kingdom organization, there's a church coming in here. We'll give them a discount because they're doing good church things. The property is sold at a discount. The church comes in, the new church plant comes in, not understanding the cost of reparations. And as they realize they can't quite make it, they sell that building, but they realize, hold on, this building's worth quite a lot now. And 5 years later, they make a huge amount of money.
Yes.
The original congregation feels awful.
Yes.
Because they don't share in that uplift.
Yep.
This is known, isn't it? And we'll put a link to this great article that we came across the other day called Hermit Crab Churches. And the idea of the hermit crab is that the hermit crab will just go and occupy a shell. We've seen this, and both Dave and I are very involved in church planting movements. We've seen this from church plants where they will move from one heritage building to another without doing the repairs, and the building eventually falls apart. Yeah. Again, in terms of valuation, that valuation of that building is worth more the more it crumbles apart. That's a terrible situation. If everybody refuses to fix it up, in a sense, the last person holding it when it does crumble is the one who will receive that financial uplift. And this is often, unfortunately, a strategy of some what we would call more unscrupulous developers. Yeah. These are some of the hard questions we wanted to get into. So that wraps us up for this session on valuation. Maybe you came into this thinking, I'm not so sure I'm excited by this session, but we hope you've understood that these issues will come up in conversation. And again, they are a bedrock for understanding the future choices that you face. So here's something I think Jeff or Jane would appreciate.
Yeah.
I heard this the other day. I might not get it exactly right, but it was something like most tech stocks are reporting somewhere like 20% of their valuation in intangible assets, right? Okay. So here's their people, here's their output of their technology from the revenue. Yeah. But there are intangible assets around this technology that are so hard to describe.
Right.
And I think, oh man, you must really make those accountants work hard to figure that one out. But this is what this conversation is about, isn't it? It's the intangible assets. The tangible assets we can talk about.
Yes.
But the intangibles, everybody has a different view of what that means when it comes to these properties.
Well, I think when we look at valuation, when I look at it being undervalued, so let's start with that. There's an undervalue within the properties. Why do we say that? 5% may be being used in a given week. So they're underutilized. The land asset itself, we don't need the big environmental footprint.
Or they sold. We hear the idea these buildings are being sold for pennies on the dollar. Is that true?
Right.
What does that mean?
Right. So we're undervaluing the land asset, the space in which we carry. Often we undervalue it because we have not looked at what's possible within the space itself.
Intangible.
The intangible, 100%. So we have to begin to look at what could be if we look at the space more than just my usership of it.
And Jeff or Jane, if they come to this dangerously, they will come with the answer wrapped up, right? They'll come and say, I know how to get a professional independent building evaluation, right? That's it. If they come with an open hand to say, how do you see what we have here? What is the value to you? And give that, remembering back to the idea of shareholders or stakeholders, if they say, I respect the way in which you assess the value, not only of what's here today, but what could be here tomorrow.
Right.
Jeff or Jane will create an environment in which this conversation can happen.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's about leveraging or seeing what we have, the assets which we have, but how could those be invested for greater impact? And that impact can look like social, community impact. The impact can look like financial sustainability. The impact can look like a number of different things. But what do we have? What do we carry? But let's ensure that that is not just sitting there dormant. Let's get those assets working for the community, which is what good investment is. And then again, not just getting dollars back, but what are those community good, the ways in which the community can actually participate in the impact.
So Jeff or Jane know that that's where we want to go, right? We want to come up with a solution. But this is a geeky part of things, figuring out these valuations and the different sources of them and why people are often talking across each other around these. If we could figure that part out and then we get on to those different bottom lines, then we can begin.
Yes.
We've got more of the tools in our tool belt now to figure this out.
Yeah.
So Jeff or Jane, right, in a publicly listed company, 20 years ago, life was easier. You have shareholder returns, either in a dividend that's paid out, some kind of profit reporting, which may impact the share price, and you have long-term sustainability of the business. You are delivering results for a shareholder, and it's very clear what those measures are. The bottom lines are very, very clear. The reason I say 20 years ago is the whole ESG movement, the sustainability questions, equity, diversity, inclusion, these now are adding additional layers to what even a publicly listed company is expected to produce. So it's becoming more complicated. One might argue in a helpful way. With a piece of social purpose real estate like a faith property, the social purpose part now has to be measured on its own. What did you mean by that? Is that a Christian purpose, a community purpose, a heritage purpose? And now the main point we're trying to get across is that there will come an incredible conflict if you don't have the language to be able to understand the trade-offs between those bottom lines when the big decisions come.
So every member of the board shows up with what they think is their primary objective.
Yeah.
Financial sustainability. Someone else, it's no, we've got to stay in our tradition. Someone else comes with environmental. So they all bring in.
They'll even say, I'm the environment guy.
No, they will. No, for sure. 100%.
Instead of understanding the whole board has to be the environment entity.
Right.
Right? People get themselves in those corners all the time. I care about the kids. You don't care about the kids. And you think, hold on, what do you mean I don't care about the kids? Right?
And every time we meet with, for example, a developer, they say what happens is churches don't know what their bottom line is. Yeah. So they create an RFP, which we'll get into if you don't know what that means, from the request for proposal, from a laundry list of everyone's bottom. So everyone goes, well, I want this. I want affordable housing. Well, I want to keep our tradition. Well, we got to meet the deferred maintenance in our building. Well, so now you've got this laundry list of objectives where a developer looks at it and goes, we can't do that because they compete with each other. So there needs to be a strategic filter that allows you to sift through to go, what are our primary objectives?
This may be a piece for another day, but let's just pick it up while we're here because you brought it up. Dave, what you brought up when you talked about the developer collecting the laundry list.
Yes.
You identified one of the great dangers of the unscrupulous developer, right? Because that person will go around and listen to what everybody wants, put it on a document and say, I promise to deliver you all of these things. Sign here.
You can't.
Right? And there's a little clause that says, I didn't actually promise you any of those things, but I wrote them on the cover page of this document.
That's right.
It's not always the easiest thing to go and tell a congregation, you cannot get everything on that laundry list.
You can't get on the list. You cannot keep the parking lot. Address your deferred maintenance.
Build deeply affordable housing.
Deeply affordable housing.
And fix the tower.
And
keep the pews in.
And keep you can't.
With a perfectly tuned organ.
And reimagine mission. You're just what do you want to do?
And all the kids come back.
And hopefully all the kids come back. So you can't do it all. You need to clarify what your primary bottom lines or objectives are. And I think, again, to do that, you need a tool.
Yeah.
And I think it's too difficult for congregations to actually come to those objectives on their own. I think they do need a tool, a guide that can help them sift through to here are our primary objectives, and here's what we want to see accomplished with our asset.
They also need to set aside time for this part.
They do.
Don't they?
They do.
Because it's easy. You remember that Presbyterian friend of ours, he said,
Yeah.
we said, what's the vision for this particular meeting? And he said, vision? Our only vision is to be done this meeting before midnight. Right? How many times have we seen congregations try to figure out their priority bottom line
Right.
at the end of a long meeting where everybody is overwhelmed,
Right.
they're
No, for
tired,
sure.
they want to go home, and somebody gets up and says, for heaven's sake, the only thing that matters here is affordable housing.
Yeah.
Which really does matter. Or the only thing that it
Yeah.
matters is, the planet is warming up, we need to do something about
Right.
it.
Right.
They're right. But very often these decisions aren't given the amount of the right kind of quality time and space.
Yes.
And that decision of we will do X at the expense of A, B, and C,
That's right.
it ends up being not enough work to make such big decisions.
That's true.